Welcome to the Comply and Outperform webinar series, where we explore the challenges, opportunities, and innovations shaping the AML and KYC landscape.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Shilo Grayson, and for those of you who've joined these webinars before, you'll know that I'm a new face presenting today. Typically, our co-founders, Stephen and Tom, would usually lead these sessions. Both approach this world from a legal and regulatory background as former investigatory lawyers. My own background is a little bit different. I've joined KYC 360 from the national security and intelligence sector across the pond in the States, where I worked primarily for a defense contractor on adversary sanctions evasion and financial crime networks. That experience, particularly working in how illicit finance flows evolve and exploit weak controls in the commercial sector, gives me a deep appreciation of today's topic, which is what went wrong at Monzo. Not just for the insights into the specific challenger bank, but also as a lens for understanding how innovation without scalable compliance can expose firms to systemic risk. By the end of this session, I want to achieve four things. The first is to unpack why Monzo failed its anti-money laundering, or AML, and sanctions controls. The second is to analyze broader control failures in the challenger bank environment, including notably at Starling Bank, which is another UK-based challenger bank that faced a similar fine from the FCA just a couple months earlier to identify recurring structural weaknesses. The third is to understand key operational, cultural, and governance factors that led to FCA action. And the fourth is to apply those practical lessons on how firms can grow and innovate while embedding compliance as a core business enabler rather than as a perceived constraint. So with that, let's talk a little bit about Monzo. Monzo is one of the UK's most prominent digital challenger banks. And when we say challenger banks, we're primarily talking about a subsector of retail banks that took off really around the mid-2010s that were designed to disrupt traditional high street banking by leveraging modern technology and leaner operating models. They typically operate without any brick or mortar presence, so they tend to be digital only, and Monzo adheres to that models. Monzo itself was founded in 2015 and is headquartered in London. It markets itself as a transparent, customer-centric alternative to legacy banks. It received its full PRA and FCA banking license in 2017, having operated on a partial license from the FCA from 2016 onwards. And it's experienced explosive growth really since its founding. In 2018, it had about 600,000 customers, and as of April 2025, it had more than 12 million. So that growth story is extraordinary, but it's also the seedbed of a lot of the serious compliance failures that we'll examine today. Now, as a brief overview of the scandal, in July 2025, the FCA issued a £21 million fine against Monzo. Importantly, this penalty was two-pronged. So the first prong is in addressing the serious AML systems and control failings that occurred within Monzo between October of 2018 and August of 2020. So this prong kind of covers deficiencies in customer due diligence, or CDD, risk assessment, transaction monitoring, and governance, all of which were taking place during a period of rapid customer and product expansion. And then the second prong of this fine is Monzo's breach of a voluntary requirement, or a VREQ, which was imposed by the FCA in August of 2020. And under that VREQ, the bank was explicitly prohibited from onboarding high-risk customers until key weaknesses were remediated. Despite this, between August of 2020 and June of 2022, Monzo opened 26,325 high-risk accounts, which was in direct contravention of its own undertaking to the FCA. And this again occurred at a time when the customer base surged from around 600,000 in 2018 to, by the end of 2022, 5.8 million. So a rapid 4 years of growth. And the FCA noted in the final action issued against Monzo that Monzo's compliance capacity, government structures, and oversight just simply did not scale in line with that rapid growth, leading both to the initial failings and to the subsequent breach of the VREQ. Now, looking at Monzo, we've identified 4 broad categories of failure. The first is inadequate customer due diligence, or CDD. Housed within this as well as inadequate enhanced due diligence, or EDD. The second is poor customer risk assessment and onboarding. The third is inadequate transaction monitoring. And the fourth is failures in governance and culture. Now, before we examine each of these 4 in depth, it's important to recognize that structurally, each of these need to be considered against the backdrop of exponential growth that Monzo was undergoing and that we've already briefly discussed. So during that same period of growth in 2018 to 2020, when the core failures in that first prong were being investigated, the firm expanded its product portfolio beyond kind of basic personal accounts, which is what it had opened with offering in 2015, to include business accounts and lending products, both of which significantly increased the complexity of its financial crime risk profile. However, the firm's risk assessment methodologies, resource allocation, and governance structures remained largely catered to its earlier, simpler business model, which really only had to do with the opening of those personal accounts, and had to do with the opening of those personal accounts for much lower customer numbers. So the internal understanding of financial crime risk, including typologies, customer segmentation, and transaction behavior, did not evolve in line with that changing operating environment. And important to this is that at a governance level, compliance was consistently deprioritized relative to the customer acquisition and product delivery objectives that the bank held. So the FCA noted that Monzo failed to ensure that the scale and experience of its compliance function kept pace with the growth of the business. Senior management oversight of AML and sanctions compliance remained very fragmented. The bank had no clear single point of accountability until 2020, when a permanent MLRO was appointed after almost 2 years of interim arrangements preceding that. So taken together, these conditions create an environment in which the volume and diversity of customers that the bank was handling was increasing sharply, at the same time that the range and complexity of products was expanding, but the capacity, the governance, the sophistication of compliance controls did not adjust proportionately to that environment. So the 4 categories of failure that we're going to look closely at, and again, that's the CDD, onboarding, monitoring, and governance, are best understood not as isolated control weaknesses, but as symptoms of this kind of larger strategic misalignment between growth, product complexity, and compliance capability. And that leads us into our first key failing, which is inadequate customer due diligence, or CDD. And Monzo's framework on this case failed at a fundamental level, really in terms of the information that the bank collected during CDD, but even more notably in the information that it failed to collect at this stage in the onboarding process. So data that they did not collect or verify in their CDD or KYC processes included the proposed purpose and intended nature of the business relationship. So at a very basic level, the type of activity that the account was intended for. The expected transaction types or value ranges, meaning that the bank couldn't later assess if activity was consistent with expectations, as the expectations themselves had never been collected, or there were no data points collected to create those expectations. The source of funds or source of wealth for business accounts, and the identity of all beneficial owners and PSCs, or persons of significant control. So during the remediation period that the bank undertook between 2020 and 2022, Monzo had to verify 19,198 beneficial owners that it previously either wasn't aware of or hadn't verified. So you have kind of this large-scale data collection control failure. Looking at the information that Monzo did collect, it did ask for addresses from prospects, but it failed to, and was actually quite loud in its announcement of its intention to fail to validate addresses. So Monzo promoted the lack of address verification as a feature of its platform. Between 2018 and 2020, it advertised on its website and social media that customers could get an account even without proof of address. And this led to some truly incredible failures, including allowing accounts with addresses like 10 Downing Street or Buckingham Palace to be onboarded without any red flags being raised internally. And then in addition to those bogus addresses, despite the fact that the bank was operating with a license that only allowed it to onboard UK residents and UK persons, because there was no address verification system in place, quite a few foreign nationals gained access to the bank's systems simply by adding on UK postcodes to foreign addresses. And this managed to bypass any of the control systems that the bank implemented, allowing foreign persons onto the platform without any control checks. So from a risk perspective, this created an easy, very visible, and high utility entry point for both fraudsters and money launderers for several reasons. The first of which is the predictability of the weakness. So the lack of verification was publicized by the banks, meaning that would-be criminals did not need to, for instance, probe the system to identify vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities were already being actively advertised to them. Secondly, there was no friction to identity layering within the platform. So false or implausible addresses enabled synthetic identities, burner accounts, or accounts used very briefly and then abandoned. And those two factors had a signaling effect to criminal networks. Because Monzo created and advertised a very clear and highly exploitable access point into the financial system, it made its own services very attractive to fraudsters or money launderers. Now, along with just these general CDD failures, Monzo also demonstrated a series of EDD or enhanced due diligence deficiencies. Until August of 2020, Monzo's policies did not define when or how enhanced due diligence should be triggered or documented, meaning that for most of this period, EDD simply was not done, even when there were clear risk indicators like foreign addresses, PEP connections, etc. And the FCA noted on this point that Monzo had no internal definition of a PEP whatsoever and relied solely on a third-party vendor for screening. Now, this third-party vendor did adhere to the FCA definition of a PEP, but when those screening results were returned to Monzo and processed internally, Monzo had no structured adjudication process, and this, of course, led to long backlogs and inconsistent treatment of PEPs, given that the bank itself didn't know what PEPs were in its own definitions. So here we have in CDD, a textbook example of policy without process, and in EDD, a textbook example of no policy and no process. So failings on both accounts, just to varying levels of egregiousness. So in short, where the bank did have written policies, it didn't have the operational discipline to make them real. And in its EDD processes, it didn't have the policies, and it also didn't have the operational discipline. So failings on both accounts here. And this leads us into poor customer risk assessment and onboarding. So starting here with flawed risk categorization. Somewhat incredibly, Monzo defaulted all customers to a no identified risk rating unless a very specific issue was raised. And this meant that practically for a vast majority of customers, including those with inherently higher risk features, such as foreign residency, opaque ownership, unusual funding patterns, an unclear source of wealth, you name it, no meaningful risk rating existed at all. And it's important here to tie this back to the inadequate customer due diligence that we've already discussed. A major contributor to this was the fact that minimal data was captured at onboarding. because Monzo only collected those bare essentials, a name, a date of birth, an identity document, and it did not collect information, again, on occupation, income level, source of funds, the purpose of the account, or expected transactional behavior. The very data points that would be required to determine whether a customer would be at low, medium, or high risk to the business did not exist. The bank simply did not have access to them, and it could not determine a risk profile through which to monitor existing relationships, meaning that Monzo had no baseline against which to judge normal or suspicious behavior for the vast majority of its customer accounts. And this also means that the bank routinely failed to detect obvious red flags. And this included multiple accounts being opened from the same address, repeated use of identical device IDs, and transactional behavior that made no sense in the context of the minimal KYC information that was being held by the bank. And underpinning all of this was the choice from Monzo to prioritize frictionless onboarding at all costs. So Monzo publicly advertised the ease and speed of joining the platform, presenting the absence of traditional KYC friction as a competitive advantage. The board and senior leadership emphasized this message across marketing channels, emphasizing rapid access, minimal documentation, and instant usability. In fact, customers were often able to transact on the platform before CDD or EDD checks were complete, even though Monzo had assured the FCA as early as 2018 that this would not happen. So essentially, to compensate for the thin onboarding process that the bank had implemented, Monzo assumed that transaction monitoring at later stages would catch issues, which, as we'll discuss now, was always going to be a structurally flawed approach. And that leads us nicely into our third issue, which is ineffective transaction monitoring. And here, again, a lot of the issues come back to the lack of data that was collected at the outset of the business relationship for almost all prospects entering Monzo's banking ecosystem. So given the weak onboarding data, Monzo's transaction monitoring systems had very little to work with. The FCA noted that Monzo was unable to effectively assess whether transactions were consistent with expected activity. And this is really entirely expected when you consider the lack of data that Monzo held on its customers and on its prospects. There was very little data to actually feed into a transaction monitoring system that would accord with a risk relationship or adhere to a risk model and enable really thorough risk-based processing. And of course, because of this, the transaction monitoring systems that Monzo used generated large numbers of false positives, but those systems were never recalibrated, and the bank either ignored or suppressed the alerts that were generated. Similar to this, there was no clear ownership of alert investigation, and reviews lacked documentation or quality assurance. A big part of this is because of the fact that the AML management team was underexperienced. There were unclear reporting lines and inadequate training. The firm had essentially no linkage between its transaction monitoring roles and its documented money laundering risk appetite. And because of that, that lack of linkage gave very little leeway to teams to act upon. The AML teams that were used didn't have enough information or training to work with. So the core takeaway here is really about data quality. Transaction monitoring systems are only as effective as the information that are fed into them. If our onboarding data omits key attributes, such as customer occupation, source of funds, expected transactional behavior, then even the most advanced monitoring tools will produce unreliable outputs. It is, very classically the garbage in, garbage out dynamic. Data quality is the foundation of effective automation, and firms that invest in getting those inputs right with accurate CDD information, very clearly defined risk parameters, and oversight will find that technology amplifies their strengths rather than their weaknesses. But as we see in the case with Monzo, the lack of that data and the lack of a well-calibrated technological system that was supporting well-trained teams comes together to create an oversight vacuum, essentially. And that leads us to our fourth and final major issue, which is failures in governance and culture. The FCA concluded in its report that one of the root causes of Monzo's failings was governance-related and cultural. So the firm's systemic deficiencies stemmed ultimately from a lax compliance culture, which regarded regulatory obligations as secondary and, in fact, often antithetical to commercial and growth objectives. And this ultimately leads to a very reactive rather than proactive view of the compliance environment. Notably here is the fact that between 2018 and 2020, as we've already briefly mentioned, Monzo's MLRO function was held only on an interim basis. It was divided among several senior managers who had other core responsibilities in senior functions of the business. So this arrangement left really no single accountable individual for AML oversight and ultimately contributed to inconsistent escalation and limited visibility at the board level. During the same period, Monzo's customer base was obviously expanding by millions, and its product set was diversifying to include business accounts and lending products. But enhancements to the overall compliance framework were only introduced after regulatory intervention. The FCA again observed that management adopted a reactive posture in implementing change programs and did so only when required by external pressure, rather than through internal risk assessment or foresight. And here again, I want to return to the impact that the public-facing priority that Monzo instituted at a cultural and governance level had on compliance teams and compliance results. Because Monzo positioned its brand so firmly around the idea of frictionless onboarding and rapid customer acquisition, it failed to update its compliance functions or to include those functions as key strategic priorities at a board level. This was repeatedly emphasized in marketing materials for the bank as a key differentiator. The fact that address verification was not necessary, that you could begin transacting on the platforms before receiving a card at the address that you had put down at the onboarding stage. This was all very publicly advertised at a time when the bank's internal systems and controls were, demonstrably insufficient, and at a time as well when the bank was aware of those insufficiencies and had been warned repeatedly by the FCA and by external reviewers of those insufficiencies. And so the result of this is a fundamental misalignment between public messaging and regulatory expectation, wherein convenience was prioritized over due diligence at all four of these key failure stages. And the strategic emphasis on frictionless onboarding, of course, shapes employee behavior, internal decision-making, ultimately embedding the perception that compliance requirements were obstacles to the user experience rather than enablers of a trusted service delivery. And this again leads us to lack of accountability. So when the voluntary requirement, or VREQ, was imposed in August of 2020, which again explicitly restricted onboarding of high-risk customers, the firm failed to assign clear ownership for that implementation. Subsequent reviews found that several key employees were just completely unaware that the restriction existed, and government's documentation around the VREQ was either incomplete or completely absent. An independent legal review, which was conducted on the issue, ultimately concluded that Monzo had applied an insufficiently robust governance framework to manage the VREQ, and that insufficient governance was characterized by fragmented oversight and weak internal communication. The FCA, of course, ultimately determined that Monzo breached the VREQ repeatedly, opening tens of thousands of high-risk accounts in contravention of its own undertaking. So collectively, these findings indicate a governance environment that prioritized speed and growth over control. Compliance was reactive, it was decentralized, and it was under-resourced. And here we start to see the broader lesson for all institutions, kind of cross-sectorally, that effective governance must be anticipatory. It can't just be remedial. embedding compliance kind of at that strategic level through defined accountability, board engagement, and alignment of incentives has the capacity to transform compliance from that perceived constraint into a driver of operational resilience, customer confidence, and sustainable growth. Now, having looked and addressed those key failures at Monzo, I want to take this opportunity to address another FCA enforcement action that was taken towards another challenger bank, Starling. And I'll do this very briefly, but I think it is important to do purely because of how strikingly similar the two instances of failure are. So just quickly looking at Starling. In October of 2024, Starling, which is another UK-based challenger bank, was fined £29 million by the FCA for very similar failings to the ones that we just looked at for Monzo. Between 2019 and 2023, Starling failed to maintain adequate financial crime systems and opened over 54,000 high-risk accounts in breach of a VREQ, very similarly to Monzo, and also like Monzo, expanded and grew far faster than its compliance team could resource. So here we see that the issue isn't one rogue bank. It's a subsector problem rooted in how many challenger banks equated innovation with deregulation. And innovation, of course, is not limited to the challenger bank sector. It is something that every firm and every regulated industry is focused on. And in looking at where these challenger banks went wrong, I think kind of across industries, we are given very good insight into how to go about innovating hand in hand with compliance. So just very quickly highlighting the key failings at Starling, which mirror Monzo across these four key areas. So of course, the first is inadequate CDD, weak KYC protocols, and failure to investigate high-risk customers, staffing and skills deficiencies, compliance functions didn't grow with the business, and staff lacked training or expertise in evolving risks. Of course, then we have inadequate transaction monitoring, including over-reliance on automated systems with major shortcomings. And finally, a failure to address known issues. The bank was repeatedly warned by the FCA, but failed to remediate or change its onboarding practices. And I think it is quite striking when we look at these four key failings to think back to Monzo and realize that we are essentially looking at the same slide. This is the same set of issues in the same subsector and the same environment, mirrored very, very closely. And just kind of hammer that home, we have shared causes and failures here. So across both banks, we see the same root causes: exponential growth without compliance scaling, rapid expansion outpaced risk management and governance, and the pursuit of frictionless onboarding at the expense of compliance infrastructure and internal controls fueled these large-scale enforcement actions. Automation without assurance, heavy reliance on automated tools, particularly in transaction monitoring, without sufficient human validation, and again, without adequate data that you would need to use these tools effectively. Governance and resourcing gaps, compliance teams were understaffed, undertrained, and underempowered. And finally, tone at the top. Senior management prioritized customer acquisition over compliance despite repeated internal warnings. And yet, when we look at these shared causes, we also see some semblance of a solution, which is largely that firms that invest in scalable, tech-enabled compliance that is backed by good data can turn what is here perceived as a cost center into a competitive advantage. And that brings us to key lessons from both cases. The first, and perhaps the most obvious, is that compliance must scale with innovation. Compliance resources, this is personnel, systems, training, governance structures, they must scale in line with customer volume and product complexity. Growth initiatives and new product launches must include documented financial crime risk impact assessments before deployment. Technology investment should not focus solely on user experience, but rather equivalent investment must be directed at data capture, risk analytics, and governance tooling. In a similar vein, boards and investors should view compliance expenditure not as margin erosion, but as capital protection. Regulatory enforcement actions, like the ones taken against Monzo and Starling, consistently cost many, many multiples of what proactive compliance scaling would have required. And this leads us to our second lesson, which is that there are no shortcuts to robust CDD. Ultimately, a complete verified picture of your customer is non-negotiable. Tech can certainly streamline this process, but it cannot replace oversight throughout it. Skipping due diligence steps for the sake of frictionless onboarding invariably results in retrospective remediation, regulatory scrutiny, and reputational damage, all of which are, again, far more expensive and costly, both from a profit standpoint and also from a reputational standpoint, as opposed to just doing it right from the outset. The third here is that a strong compliance culture is essential. I want to go back to the fact that between 2018 and 2020 at Monzo, during this period in which both product offerings and product lines, as well as the bank's own customer base, were scaling exponentially, the bank operated with only an interim MLRO, and compliance oversight was distributed amongst executives whose principal duties lay elsewhere. The absence of a single accountable senior function creates inconsistency, lack of escalation protocols, and poor visibility to the board. For all institutions, cross-sectorally, the implication here is that culture is both a risk driver and a risk mitigant. Tone from the top must continuously reinforce that compliance is a primary business function. Senior management need to be measurably accountable for AML and sanctions performance through KPIs and board reporting, and compliance teams must have sufficient authority, independence, and resources to challenge commercial decisions. And in those environments, when compliance is positioned as an enabler of sustainable growth rather than a constraint, firms can achieve both regulatory resilience and investor confidence. And that leads us to continuous improvements. Systems need to be regularly stress tested, audited, and evolved. The pace of financial crime innovation that we're seeing today demands the same pace of compliance innovation. And this system or cycle of continuous improvement should be formalized through governance and defined review cycles, ownership, metrics. And again, part of this continuous improvement cycle is ensuring that the data that is being fed into these systems is the right data that can inform thorough risk assessments and risk profiles for all customer relationships, that data is being kept up to date, that you can, through that process, avoid these large-scale remediation projects. And we see that institutions that treat AML systems as set-and-forget controls will, by definition, fall behind both criminal activity and regulators. And thus, we see it's necessary to move away from that tick box approach and towards event-driven reviews, perpetual screening and monitoring, and proactive compliance cultures. Ultimately, what we're driving at here is that compliance and growth are not opposites. They are, in fact, mutually reinforcing when done well. Firms that understand that lead the market, and those that don't are faced with these large-scale fines and remedial actions. And at KYC 360, we talk a lot in sports analogies, particularly with inspiration from the world of Formula One, which might seem like a non-obvious space to derive inspiration from, but actually, I think the analogies here are quite strong. And in particular, we like to talk about Senna. In 1994, as if anyone here watching is a Formula One fan, you might recall that in 1994, at the San Marino Grand Prix in Imola, Ayrton Senna, one of the greats of racing, very tragically lost his life on the track. It was a tragic weekend. Actually, two drivers, Senna and one other, died on the track that weekend, and it exposed serious weaknesses in the cars, the culture, and the governance of the sport. And notably, what we try to drive at here is that between 1950 and Senna's death in 1994, 52 Formula One drivers died while competing. In the 30 years since Senna's death, only one has died on the track. But the cars today are roughly 4 seconds faster per lap than they were on the track in Imola in 1994. What we really try to get at here is the fact that performance and safety and adherence to regulation are not opposites. They actually mutually drive at each other and reinforce each other. It is possible to both comply and outperform. And as you'll see in our slide decks, behind me now, I've got some kayakers. And if you've been looking at the photos within the slide deck, you'll see lots of extreme sports analogies. But what we get at here is that when we perform at our best, it is typically against a backdrop of highly regulated environments. Every extreme sport is highly, highly regulated, and every extreme sport drives its participants to a place of outperformance. And that is really the culture that we're trying to drive at in compliance through good data and through good technology. So as we close, I want to briefly show you what that good looks like in practice, what it looks like when compliance, data, and technology are built to scale together rather than in conflict with one another. The KYC 360 platform is designed as a modular end-to-end solution that supports the full customer lifecycle, from onboarding to due diligence to ongoing monitoring, all the way through to CLM, or client lifecycle management. But crucially, every module here is underpinned by the same philosophy that we've been discussing today, which is a genuinely risk-based approach that is aimed at allowing institutions to outperform through compliance. One of the core strengths of our platform is that it doesn't treat every customer as the same. Instead, each workflow is dynamically configured based on real-time risk scoring happening in the background. As a customer progresses through onboarding, the platform continually recalculates their risk profile, and that live calculation determines what information you need to collect, what questions appear to your prospect, and which checks are triggered. So low-risk customers here experience a fast, streamlined onboarding journey, whereas our higher-risk customers see additional questions, enhanced due diligence steps, or specific verification requirements, all without your team needing to manually intervene or redesign the workflow each time. So this is responsive, it's configurable, and it ensures that you're collecting the right data in order to get through your entire client lifecycle management with a complete and accurate view of your customer's risk profile. On the verification side, our automated CDD and identity verification tools, including EID and V, ensure that accurate information is captured and validated at the very first interaction. And as part of this, we are able to do address verification in quite a few jurisdictions, which means that you do not get away with putting down 10 Downing Street on our platforms. And it means that you start with good data, which, as we discussed earlier, is the single biggest determinant of whether your downstream controls work. We then layer this with live risk assessment. Our 3D risk-based screening engine looks across multiple dimensions, including identity, geography, behavior, and external data sets, reducing false positives while ensuring true risk is surfaced early. So for your teams, this means fewer noisy alerts and more meaningful prioritization of cases. And then instead of relying on periodic calendar-based reviews, which we've seen repeatedly are too slow and too easily outdated, we enable a shift to event-driven continuous monitoring. So the system automatically detects anything that changes that is of relevance to you and your team. So this can be expired documents, sanctions list updates, new adverse media, shifts in ownership structure, changes in expected activity. And all of those trigger a review only when something material actually moves that impacts your risk profile of that customer. So this for us is what scalable modern compliance looks like. It's not more reviews, but smarter reviews. And finally, we consolidate all of this into a single actionable view of risk. So your teams aren't hunting through spreadsheets, emails, legacy systems. They get one dashboard, one workflow, and one source of truth, which frees your compliance staff to focus on those high-value judgment calls rather than on administrative work. So when we talk about compliance and growth not being opposites, this is what we mean. With the right architecture, with the right technology, and with the right data, you can onboard and manage customer relationships faster and safer while reducing operational cost and improving regulatory resilience. So you can innovate without exposing your institution to unmanaged risk and 21 million or 29 million pound fines. So this is the design philosophy behind KYC 360. It is modular, configurable, risk-driven, and built to scale. And this is exactly the kind of solution that prevents the type of failures that we've examined today and supports the kind of sustainable growth that regulators expect and our customers trust. Now, before we wrap up, I want to highlight one final piece of the broader KYC 360 ecosystem, and that's the KYC 360 Academy. Because as we've seen throughout today's session, technology really is only one part of the solution, and the other part is people. The knowledge that your teams have, the decisions that they take, and the culture that they both create and reinforce. And the Academy is designed to support those teams. We provide targeted, structured training for financial crime professionals, analysts, senior managers, and even non-technical board members who still have regulatory accountability. Our curriculum is comprehensive and it is intentionally practical. We cover the core pillars of financial crime prevention, anti-money laundering, know your customer, sanctions risk management, high-risk jurisdiction controls, risk profiling, governance expectations, all of the areas that determine whether an institution is genuinely resilient or merely compliant on paper. And one of the futures organizations tell us that they value most here is our focus on lessons from failure, which is exactly what we've done today. We analyze real-world enforcement cases, just like Monzo, just like Starling. We break down how the failures happened, where the governance breakdowns occurred, and which controls would have prevented the harm. We do believe, as a core principle, that it is one thing to understand a regulation. It is quite another to understand how, in practice, institutions fail to meet it. And the Academy is designed to bridge that gap. We also offer dedicated programs for C-suite executives and boards, because senior leadership's understanding of their oversight duties is one of the strongest predictors of an organization's compliance culture. These courses focus on governance, on accountability, financial crime risk appetite, and the tone from the top responsibilities that determine whether compliance is integrated into strategic decision-making or sidelined by commercial pressure. So that's really it from me today. Thank you all for joining and thank you for your time. We've covered a lot of ground, not just on what went wrong at Monzo, but also what those failures reveal about the pressures, trade-offs, and blind spots that any fast-growing financial institution can encounter. So if there's one overarching message that I hope you take away from this webinar, it is the fact that compliance and growth are not opposing forces. One, they are designed to reinforce one another through good data, strong governance, risk-based processes, and continuous improvement. They become the foundation of sustainable performance. And we've seen today how quickly risk can accumulate when controls don't scale, when data is incomplete, or when governance is weak. But we've also seen the reverse, that with the right systems, the right culture, the right people, and the right data, institutions can grow faster, serve customers better, and operate far more safely. So for those of you who joined to benchmark your own frameworks, I hope that the session has helped you identify areas of strengths and areas that may require further attention. And for those thinking about the next stage of your own transformation journey in compliance, whether in technology, governance, training, or risk management, our team at KYC 360 is always happy to support. So thank you again for your time, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session.
Thank you for attending today. We look forward to welcoming you on our next Comply and Outperform webinar.